The preceding traces do not end in silence. They end in hesitation. What appears next in the record is not a beginning, but a careful pause and interval before names, before attributions, before the administrative clarity that later defines Sumerian writing. The earliest layers of Mesopotamian documentation seem aware of something prior to identification, as though the act of naming itself required restraint. In Thespes, before the first name was written, the tablets speak indirectly, through structure rather than declaration. The oldest clay documents recovered from southern Mesopotamia are not narratives, and not genealogies. They are marked numerical impressions, tallies pressed into wet clay, tokens sealed inside envelopes. These objects record quantities of grain, livestock, labor units, and rations, but they do so without identifying who produced them. No personal names accompany these earliest records. Labor is measured, allocated, and redistributed, yet the workers themselves remain unrecorded as individuals. This absence is not accidental. It reflects a system that accounted for output before identity, function before personhood. In later periods, names appear readily and abundantly. Scribes list overseers, supervisors, household heads, and kings with precision. But before this transition, the record implies a different conception of social existence. People are present only as capacities, as hands, as days of work, as measures of consumption. The tablets do not ask who someone was. They ask what was owed, what was delivered, what was stored. Identity, in this phase, is subordinate to obligation. Archaeologically, this period corresponds to the late 4th millennium BCE, often associated with the Uruk expansion. Monumental architecture emerges, long-distance trade intensifies, and administrative complexity increases. Yet even as cities grow, the written record remains deliberately impersonal. The scribes who developed these systems did not rush to inscribe names. They perfected signs for barley, sheep, oil, and time before they developed signs for people. This ordering suggests that writing was first a tool for maintaining continuity rather than for commemorating individuals. The absence of names may also reflect a deeper memory. In later Sumerian compositions, the act of naming is treated as consequential. To name is to fix, to assign role and permanence. Deities bestow names upon cities. Kings receive names that define their reigns, and rituals emphasize the correct pronunciation of divine and royal titles. Against this backdrop, the early reluctance to name human actors becomes more striking. It implies that there was once a conceptual boundary between the system being maintained and the beings operating within it. Some early lexical lists preserve hints of this boundary. These lists, which catalog size and their meanings, often begin with categories of objects and functions before addressing social roles. When human terms appear, they are generic, worker, dependent, child. Specific names remain absent. The language itself seems to resist individualization. It is as though the system remembered a time when naming carried weight that could not yet be assumed. Later Sumerian king lists retrospectively divide time into eras before and after decisive events. Kingship is described as descending from the heavens, withdrawn, and then restored. These texts were composed much later, but they frame history as a sequence of interruptions and renewals. In that framework, the earliest administrative silence around names may represent not ignorance, but caution. The scribes who formalized these traditions may have inherited an understanding that the earliest phase of human organization was provisional, incomplete, or deliberately unnamed. This interpretation gains weight when considering how later texts describe creation itself. Human beings are formed to fulfill functions, to perform labor for the gods, to maintain order. Their initial purpose is operational, not personal. Names are assigned later, once roles stabilize and hierarchies solidify. If these texts preserve institutional memory rather than mythic invention, then the namelessness of early records aligns with a worldview in which humanity first existed as a collective capacity rather than as a series of individuals. The Anunnaki appear in these later descriptions as authorities who define boundaries and assign functions. They measure, decree, and organize. They do not immediately individualize. Their concern is with balance and maintenance. In Dislike, the early administrative tablets can be read as an extension of that logic. The system operates, resources flow, labor is counted, but the human element remains abstracted. The record keeps track of what must continue, not who performs it. Over time, this changes. Names enter the tablets, first sparingly, then in abundance. Individuals become accountable, lineage becomes traceable, and history acquires actors. The moment when the first name is written marks a shift from pure administration to recorded memory. It is the point at which humans are no longer only functions within a system but entities within a narrative. Yet the question remains why this transition occurred when it did. If writing was capable of naming from its inception, why was naming deferred? Was it a technical limitation or a conceptual one? Did the scribes inherit a tradition that treated early humanity as an undifferentiated workforce? Or were they preserving a memory of a prior order in which individuality had not yet been granted permanence before the first name was written? What understanding of human existence was being carefully maintained, and what changed to allow that understanding to shift? The hesitation surrounding names does not disappear all at once. It is resolved, instead, by an arrival. The record begins to speak of authority, not emerging, but descending. In the earliest formulations of kingship preserved on clay, rule is not described as seized, elected, or invented. It is received. The language is careful and repetitive, as though preserving a formula older than the tablet itself. Kingship, the text states, was lowered from above and set down among humans. This phrasing appears most clearly in the compositions later compiled as king lists. These are not narrative chronicles in the modern sense. They are administrative documents structured to impose order on time. Reigns are measured in years. Cities are named as seats of power, and transitions are marked with formal consistency. Yet at the head of these lists stands a statement that does not belong to administration alone. Before any city is governed, before any reign is counted, kingship itself is said to have descended. The scribes who copied these lists treated this statement as procedural rather than symbolic. It is not explained or defended. It is simply placed at the beginning, functioning as a point of origin. Authority is treated as an external constant that enters the human domain at specific moments. The king does not create kingship. He receives it. His role is custodial. He holds an office that existed before his name was written, and will continue after it is erased. Early rulers in these lists are described with reigns of extraordinary length. Their cities are few, their succession orderly. Whether these durations were symbolic, schematic, or reflective of a different method of accounting is unclear. What matters for the scribes is not plausibility, but continuity. The long reigns stretch backward toward a time that resists precise measurement, anchoring later, more familiar rulers to a deeper temporal foundation. Kingship, in this sense, serves as a bridge between the unnamed past and the named present. Archaeological layers from early urban centers such as Kish and Eridu support this administrative worldview. Monumental buildings appear before clear evidence of individualized royal commemoration. Temples dominate the landscape, while palaces remain architecturally subdued. Authority seems embedded in institutional spaces rather than in personal display. The king operates within a framework that precedes him, aligned with cultic and economic functions already in place. In administrative tablets from the early dynastic period, the king's name begins to appear more frequently, but always alongside titles that emphasize service and stewardship. He is described as a caretaker of the god's estates, a guarantor of offerings, a stabilizer of measures. His legitimacy derives from alignment with an inherited order, not from personal achievement. Even military actions, when recorded, are framed as restorations of balance rather than acts of expansion. The descent of kingship is thus not a metaphor of power, but a statement about memory. It implies that authority is a preserved condition, one that must be re-established after disruption. Later texts describe moments when kingship is withdrawn and later returned, often following catastrophe. These cycles are recorded without commentary, as though the loss and restoration of rule were expected features of history. The king is less an originator than a marker indicating that order has resumed. Within this framework, the Anunnaki appear not as distant figures but as administrative anchors. They are invoked in oaths, temple inventories, and foundation inscriptions as guarantors of decrees and boundaries. Their role is not elaborated in narrative detail. They function as references within a system, ensuring that authority remains anchored beyond human fluctuation. The descent of kingship aligns with their presence, but the mechanism remains unstated. What is striking is how little emphasis is placed on the moment of descent itself. No ceremony is described, no physical act recorded. The scribes do not ask how kingship descended, only where it settled. The focus is on location. First, one city, then another. Authority moves geographically, not genealogically. This movement suggests that kingship is transferable, independent of lineage, reinforcing the idea that it is an office rather than a possession. As writing becomes more refined, later kings begin to inscribe their own accounts. Even then, they rarely claim to have founded kingship. They speak instead of restoring temples, re-establishing laws, and renewing decrees that had fallen into neglect. Their inscriptions echo the earlier lists in tone, emphasizing continuity over novelty. To rule is to remember correctly. The transition from nameless labor to named kingship marks a shift in how humanity is recorded, but not in how authority is conceived. Names are now written, reigns measured, and deeds listed, yet the source of order remains external and anterior. Kings stand at the intersection of memory and administration, embodying a role that was waiting for them. If kingship was understood as something that descended and could also be withdrawn, then its appearance in the record may signal not the beginning of human rule, but the resumption of a pattern after interruption. What, then, preceded the first descent, and under what conditions was authority absent before it returned? If authority could be withdrawn as easily as it descended, then silence becomes part of the record. Not a silence of absence, but one that appears deliberately between phases of order. In the physical archive of Mesopotamia, there are moments where the tablets themselves fall quiet. Layers of occupation end without inscription. Administrative sequences break off, and the steady rhythm of accounting gives way to gaps that were neither filled nor explained by the scribes who came later. These interruptions are visible, first at several early urban sites, including those that later appear prominently in king lists. Occupational layers thin or disappear altogether. Buildings are abandoned or repurposed without corresponding administrative documentation. The clay tablets that usually accompany storage rooms and distribution centers are missing. This absence is not uniform across the region, but it is patterned enough to suggest systemic disruption rather than local oversight. When writing resumes in these locations, it does so cautiously. The earliest tablets after such gaps often return to basic accounting forms. Grain measures, livestock tallies, temple inventories, personal names are sparse again, even where they had previously become common. It is as though the administrative system had to be reassembled from foundational elements, retracing steps rather than advancing them. The scribes do not comment on what was lost. They simply begin again. Later, textual traditions acknowledge interruptions obliquely. In some king lists, transitions between dynasties are marked without explanation. A city ceases to be named as a seat of kingship, and another takes its place. No reason is given. The formula remains unchanged, even when continuity clearly breaks. Kingship is said to move, but the cause of movement is left unrecorded. The silence is preserved. In archival terms, silence is not neutral. For cultures that relied on record-keeping to maintain economic and ritual stability, the absence of documentation implies a suspension of normal operations. Temples without inventories, storehouses without accounts, labor without rations recorded. These are not simply missing data points. They suggest periods when the systems that required writing were no longer functioning in their usual form. Some later Sumerian compositions describe catastrophes that reset order. Floods, divine withdrawals, the collapse of cities. These accounts are written in literary language, but they echo the material record's interruptions. They frame disaster not as an end, but as a boundary between iterations of order. What comes after is described as restoration, rebuilding, and reset. Writing, in this sense, does not record the catastrophe itself. It resumes once conditions allow memory to be fixed again. The scribes who compiled these texts treated silence as meaningful but not narratable. They did not speculate on what occurred during the gaps. Instead, they preserved the structure before and after, allowing the discontinuity to stand on its own. This approach suggests an inherited understanding that certain phases of existence were not meant to be fully articulated, perhaps because they lay outside the jurisdiction of administrative order. The Anunnaki appear in this context as stabilizing references rather than actors within the silence. Their names are invoked when records resume, anchoring decrees and boundaries. They are absent from the gaps themselves. This absence may imply that during periods of disruption, the relationship between humans and the ordering authorities was altered or suspended. The texts do not clarify how, only that normal functions eventually returned. What is notable is that when writing resumes, it does not claim novelty. New rulers do not announce unprecedented beginnings. Instead, they speak of restoring temples to their proper places, renewing offerings, and re-establishing measures as they were before. The language assumes a remembered standard that predates the interruption. Civilization is treated not as something rebuilt from nothing, but as something recalled. In administrative practice, this memory takes concrete form. Old sign lists are reused. Measurement systems remain consistent. Ritual calendars align with earlier cycles. Even architectural plans follow established templates. The silence does not erase knowledge. It suspends its expression. When conditions permit, the record continues as though resuming a paused account. This pattern raises a subtle implication. If humanity's organization could be interrupted without being entirely forgotten, then the record we possess may represent only the phases deemed stable enough to inscribe. Other phases irregular, provisional, or unstable may have existed without leaving direct traces. The silence of the tablets does not necessarily indicate the absence of people, but the absence of a system that required them to be named and counted. If so, then the resumption of writing marks not the reappearance of humans, but the return of an order that made humans legible to authority. For and between these moments, what form did human existence take when it was no longer being recorded, and who decided when it was time for the tablets to speak again? If the return of writing marked the moment when order became legible again, then the ground beneath that order carries its own testimony. At several early Mesopotamian sites, the silence of the tablets corresponds not to abstraction but to a physical boundary. Beneath finished floors and rebuilt walls lies a distinct layer of silt, compacted in uniform, separating one phase of occupation from another. The builders who laid new foundations did so directly atop this deposit, treating it as a terminus rather than an anomaly. At Shuruppak, excavation revealed a thick flood stratum interrupting the sequence of domestic and administrative structures. Below it, the material culture follows one pattern of habitation. Above it, another resumes, recognizably related yet not continuous. The flood layer is not thin or incidental. It is extensive, cleanly defined, and regionally consistent. It contains few artifacts, suggesting not gradual inundation but sudden coverage. Similar deposits appear at Kish and other sites along the river plains, each marking a moment when settlement was forcibly reset. Archaeologists describe these layers cautiously as localized river events rather than evidence of a single global catastrophe. The deposits vary in depth and composition, implying multiple floods rather than one. Yet what is striking is not their scale, but how they are treated by subsequent builders. There is no attempt to remove the silt or integrate it into earlier levels. It is flattened, leveled, and sealed. Construction begins anew above it, as though acknowledging a boundary that should not be disturbed. This architectural decision mirrors later textual traditions that speak of a flood as a dividing line in history. Inking lists and compositions concerned with early times, reigns before the flood are separated from those after it. The flood functions as an administrative marker, a reset point after which counting resumes. The texts do not dwell on the event's mechanics. They treat it as a known rupture, requiring no elaboration. What aligns these textual divisions with the archaeological record is not chronology, but attitude. Both treat the flood as an interruption that reorganizes order without annihilating memory. After the flood, cities are rebuilt, kingship is restored, and administrative practices return. Measurement systems persist, cultic centers are re-established, and the language of restoration dominates inscriptions. The builders do not behave as founders of something new. They behave as inheritors resuming a suspended task. The flood layers themselves contain little evidence of human presence at the moment of deposition. They are largely sterile, composed of riverborne sediment rather than debris from habitation. This suggests evacuation or sudden abandonment rather than gradual decline. Whatever the precise circumstances, the effect is consistent. A pause in occupation followed by deliberate renewal. In later ritual texts, floods are associated with purification as much as destruction. Water removes impurity, resets boundaries, and prepares ground for reordering. While these texts are composed centuries after the earliest flood deposits, they reflect an institutional memory in which inundation is not random but functional. It clears space for restoration. This framing does not require a single overwhelming event. It accommodates repetition. The Anunnaki appear in these contexts as witnesses to boundaries rather than as agents of catastrophe. They are named in hymns and prayers that followed the flood, invoked to stabilize what is returned. Their role is administrative, ensuring that measures, decrees, and roles are properly reestablished. The flood itself is not attributed to them directly. It exists as a condition that necessitates their renewed involvement. What emerges from this pattern is a view of history structured around cycles of interruption and resumption. Flood layers beneath floors are not treated as anomalies to be erased, but as foundations upon which order is rebuilt. The physical landscape retains memory even when written records fall silent. The builders acknowledge this memory by sealing it beneath their work, allowing it to remain present but contained. In this sense, the flood layer functions as a threshold. Below it lies an earlier iteration of organized life. Above it, a restored one. The continuity between them is not seamless, yet it is intentional. The people who rebuilt did not see themselves as replacing what was lost. They saw themselves as continuing something that had been interrupted. If repeated floods marked moments when order was temporarily withdrawn and then restored, and if these moments were remembered both in clay and in architecture, then the question shifts. Were these interruptions understood as natural cycles, or as signals that an earlier arrangement of humanity had reached its limit, requiring reestablishment under renewed terms? If repeated interruptions required order to be reestablished, then what returned was not only building and authority, but language itself. When the tablets speak again after periods of rupture, they do not do so tentatively. The written Sumerian that emerges in the archaeological record appears already structured, already capable of precision. It does not behave like a language in the process of formation. It behaves like one being reapplied. The earliest written Sumerian texts show a system that is internally coherent from the start. Signs are polyvalent, yet rule-bound. Logograms represent objects, actions, and institutions with consistent values. Numerical systems operate alongside lexical signs without confusion. Grammatical relationships, possession, agency, direction are embedded within the structure of the writing itself. There is variation, but not uncertainty. The scribes who pressed these signs into clay were not experimenting with expression. They were executing a known method. This completeness is most evident in administrative tablets. From the earliest levels, scribes distinguish between different types of labor, grades of commodities, and institutional domains. Technical vocabulary appears without explanation. Terms for offerings, rations, land categories, and official roles are used as though their meanings were already fixed. There are no glosses, no clarifying notes, no visible scaffolding. The language assumes shared understanding. In later periods, scribal schools preserve lexical lists that categorize the world systematically. These lists are often treated as educational tools, but they also function as repositories of inherited knowledge. They do not invent categories, they conserve them. The ordering of signs within these lists suggests an attempt to stabilize meanings that were already in use. Language is treated as something that can be lost or corrupted, requiring careful preservation. What is absent from the record is any clear precursor. There are no transitional scripts showing gradual grammatical assembly. The shift from proto-writing to full Sumerian does not display intermediate stages of linguistic uncertainty. While the signs themselves evolve in form, their functional relationships appear intact from an early point. This pattern suggests that writing captured a spoken system that was already mature. From the perspective of the scribes, language was not a human invention subject to revision at will. It was a correct form that had to be learned accurately. Scribal errors are corrected, not tolerated. Deviations are treated as mistakes rather than innovations. This attitude implies that language possessed an authoritative standard beyond individual usage. In ritual and administrative contexts, correct wording was essential. A miswritten sign could invalidate an offering or alter an account. The precision required indicates that language was bound to function, not expression. Words were tools within an operational system. Their authority lay in their continuity, not in creativity. Some later texts describe moments when language itself is disrupted. Confusion of speech appears as a condition requiring divine intervention. While such passages are literary, they reflect an administrative anxiety that shared understanding can fracture. Language, like kingship, can be withdrawn and restored. its stability is not guaranteed. The Anunnaki are occasionally referenced as arbiters of decrees and destinies, entities who establish the terms by which order is articulated. They are not described as teaching language step by step. Instead, their involvement is implied in the maintenance of correct forms. Language aligns with order. Disorder manifests as miscommunication. The texts do not explain how language began, only how it must be preserved. Archaeologically, this preservation is visible in the continuity of sin usage across centuries. Even as political centers shift and dynasties change, core grammatical structures remain stable. This endurance suggests that language functioned as a backbone of civilization, carrying memory across interruptions. When cities were rebuilt and authority restored, the same linguistic framework reappeared, enabling administration to resume without The sudden appearance of a complete linguistic system does not require a singular origin event. It suggests instead that the conditions for writing emerged after the language itself was already established. Writing becomes a means of fixing what was previously maintained through other forms of transmission: oral, ritual, institutional. The tablets capture a language already shaped by long use. If civilization is remembered rather than created, then language may be its most durable memory. It survives floods, silences, and shifts in power, re-emerging intact enough to carry meaning forward. The scribes who wrote Sumerian did not see themselves as authors of language. They were its custodians. Iftatiso, then, the completeness of early Sumerian raises a quiet implication. Before it was written, where was this language held, and through what means was it preserved until the moment it could once again be impressed into clay? If language returned intact because it had been held elsewhere, then the same must be asked of number. When administrative writing resumes, it does not only speak correctly, it counts correctly. The earliest numerical tablets do not hesitate over quantity. They do not test alternatives or record approximations. They apply measures with confidence, as though the values themselves were not under negotiation. The measure was already known. From the first accounting records, numerical notation appears alongside standardized units. Grain is measured in fixed capacities. Labor is counted in regularized days. Land is expressed through established area systems. These are not provisional marks. They belong to coherent metrological frameworks that relate units to one another predictably. The scribes who used them did not annotate their choices. They assumed recognition. What emerges from these tablets is not mathematics as abstraction, but mathematics as administration. Numbers are embedded in procedure. A certain quantity of barley corresponds to a certain labor obligation. A defined area requires a defined output. These relationships are treated as stable. The system does not search for balance. It enforces one that already exists. Several numerical systems operate simultaneously in early Sumerian records. Different bases are applied depending on context: grain, livestock, time, land, yet they interlock without conflict. This layered structure suggests prior coordination. It is unlikely to have arisen through ad hoc decisions made independently by individual scribes. The harmony between systems implies inheritance. Later instructional tablets preserve tables of multiplication, reciprocals, and conversions. These are not exploratory documents. They are reference tools, copied and recopied with minimal variation. The scribal schools that produced them did not present mathematics as a field of inquiry. They presented it as a body of correct knowledge to be mastered. Error is treated as deviation from an established order, not as part of learning through trial. In building inscriptions, kings emphasize correct measurement as a moral and cosmic responsibility. Foundations are laid according to proper dimensions, walls aligned to prescribed ratios. To measure incorrectly is to disturb balance. This concern is not aesthetic. It is administrative and ritual. Proper measure ensures that offerings are sufficient, labor is fair, and boundaries are respected. Measurement sustains order. What is absent from the record is debate over units. There is no evidence of competing standards being tested or resolved. When measures appear, they do so with authority. Even when political control shifts between cities, metrological systems remain compatible. This continuity suggests that standards were not owned by any single institution. They belonged to the structure of order itself. Some later texts personify measure as something decreed rather than invented. Correct weights and capacities are described as having been established in a distant past and entrusted to rulers for safekeeping. The role of the king is to guard these measures against corruption. He does not create them. He restores them when they are neglected. The Anunnaki appear in this context as guarantors of order. They are associated with decrees, destinies, and boundaries. Measure aligns with their domain, but again without narrative elaboration. The texts do not say how measures were set, only that they are correct and must be maintained. Precision is treated as inherited responsibility. Archaeological finds reinforce this perspective. Standardized weights appear early and persist with remarkable consistency. Even as materials and inscriptions vary, the underlying values remain stable. This suggests that physical objects were produced to match remembered standards rather than to define new ones. The object conforms to the measure, not the other way around. In times of disruption, when writing falls silent and later resumes, the same numerical relationships reappear. There is no recalibration evident after flood layers or occupational gaps. The system resumes as though paused. This continuity implies that measurement knowledge survived interruptions, carried perhaps through ritual practice, oral transmission, or institutional memory beyond the reach of the archaeological record. If numbers and measures are treated as part of an enduring order, then their sudden appearance in written form reflects not discovery but recognition. Writing captures what was already functioning. The tablets do not invent balance. They record Italiano. If so, then the precision of early Sumerian mathematics raises a further implication. If measure was known before it was written and preserved through disruption, where was this knowledge held during the silences? And who was responsible for remembering it until the moment order could once again be counted? If measure could be recalled and applied without debate, then space itself appears to have been treated the same way. When the earliest cities rise again after interruption, they do not sprawl experimentally across the plain. They settle into patterns that feel already decided. Streets align, precincts repeat, and sacred complexes occupy positions that seem less chosen than reinstated. The cities are built as if remembered. In the earliest urban layers at sites such as Uruk, Eridu, and Nippur, the arrangement of space follows a consistent internal logic. Temples dominate elevated platforms, oriented with deliberate regularity. Administrative buildings cluster nearby, connected by controlled routes rather than open. Residential zones spread outward in predictable gradients. These layouts do not read as improvised solutions to immediate needs. They read as implementations of a known template. What is striking is the persistence of these templates across rebuilding phases. When flood deposits interrupt occupation, the subsequent construction does not disregard what lay beneath. Foundations are often placed directly above earlier walls, maintaining orientation even when elevation changes. Builders adapt to altered ground levels, but they do not rotate or relocate the core plan. The city reasserts its previous shape, adjusted but not redesigned. Temple architecture offers the clearest example. The successive rebuilding of cultic structures follows a pattern of enlargement rather than replacement. A shrine is expanded, elevated, and refined, but its footprint remains aligned with earlier phases. This continuity suggests reverence not only for the deity but for the correctness of the original placement. The location itself is treated as authoritative. Administrative texts reinforce this architectural conservatism. Land boundaries are described with reference to long-standing markers, canals, and paths. When disputes arise, they are resolved by appeal to earlier arrangements rather than by redrawing lines. Space is governed by precedent. The city is not a flexible organism, but a remembered order that must be respected. Builders' inscriptions reflect this attitude. Kings describe their construction projects not as new designs, but as restorations. They speak of returning temples to their rightful places and renewing foundations according to ancient plans. Even when materials change or scale increases, the language emphasizes fidelity. To build correctly is to build in accordance with what was already established. This emphasis on correctness extends to orientation. Many early structures align with cardinal directions or follow consistent axial relationships. Such precision requires shared conventions and sustained knowledge. It is unlikely to have emerged independently at multiple sites without coordination. The repetition of these spatial rules implies transmission rather than invention. Urban planning also reflects an understanding of function that predates individual projects. Areas dedicated to storage, ritual, and administration appear early and persist. Their relative positions remain stable even as cities grow. This stability suggests that the relationship between activities was already understood. Space was organized to support an inherited system of operations. The absence of alternative layouts is notable. There is little evidence of competing urban models being tested and abandoned. Variation exists, but within narrow bounds. Cities differ in scale and emphasis, yet they share a common grammar. This grammar does not announce itself as it behaves like a remembered standard. In later literary compositions, cities are sometimes described as having been founded in distant times, their plans decreed and their boundaries fixed. While these texts are composed long after the earliest urban phases, they reflect an institutional memory that treats city layout as something given rather than devised. The role of rulers is to maintain alignment with this memory. The Anunnaki are occasionally invoked as guarantors of sacred space. They are associated with temples, precincts, and the proper placement of structures. Their involvement is not architectural instruction, but validation. Correct placement aligns the city with order. Incorrect placement risks imbalance. Again, the mechanism is left unstated, but the expectation of correctness is clear. Archaeological continuity suggests that even when populations shifted or authority moved, the idea of the city endured. A site might decline, but when reoccupied, its core plan often This persistence implies that knowledge of the city's proper forms survived beyond continuous habitation. It was carried, remembered, and reapplied. If cities were built according to remembered patterns, then urbanism itself was not an open-ended process. It was constrained by an inherited understanding of how space should support order. Builders did not ask where to place the temple. They knew. They did not debate the relationship between shrine and storehouse. It was already defined. If so, then the earliest cities may not represent the first attempts at urban life, but the reappearance of a form already understood. What earlier experience of organized space informed these reconstructions? And how far back did the memory of the city extend before it was set again upon the plain? If cities rose according to remembered alignments, then authority within them appears to have followed an even older pattern. In the administrative and legal tablets, decisions are not presented as the outcome of human deliberation alone. They are framed as confirmations of determinations already in place. Before disputes are settled, before boundaries are fixed, before obligations are enforced, the texts repeatedly refer to decisions that have, in some sense, already been made. In the earliest legal and administrative records, the Anunnaki are not characters in stories. They appear as references within formulas. Oaths are sworn in their presence. Contracts are validated by their names, and decrees are issued according to their authority. These references function less as invocations and more as acknowledgments. The documents do not ask the gods to decide. They recognize that a decision exists and must be aligned with court records from later periods. Preserve this structure clearly. Human judges preside over cases, hear testimony, and issue rulings. Yet the language of judgment consistently situates these actions within a higher framework. The verdict is correct, not because it satisfies the parties involved, but because it conforms to what is described as a divine order. The Anunnaki are named as guarantors of justice, not as participants in debate. Their role is prior. Boundary stones and land grants further illustrate this hierarchy. These inscriptions list measurements, ownership, and conditions, then conclude with a sequence of divine names. The placement of these names is not decorative. It establishes that the arrangement is binding beyond human lifespans. To violate the terms is not merely illegal. It is a transgression against an inherited order. The gods do not negotiate these terms. They stand behind them. What is notable is that the texts rarely describe the process by which divine decisions are reached. There are no deliberations recorded, no councils transcribed. The Anunnaki are treated as a source of determination rather than as agents whose reasoning must be explained. This absence suggests that for the scribes, divine decision-making was not a subject for documentation. It was assumed in administrative practice. This assumption has practical consequences. Ration lists, labor assignments, and temple inventories operate under fixed expectations of fairness and proportion. These expectations are not argued for. They are applied. When irregularities occur, They are framed as failures to adhere to established norms, not as opportunities to revise them. Correction means restoration, not reform. Kings, when issuing laws or proclamations, adopt the same posture. They do not claim originality. Instead, they describe themselves as executors of decrees entrusted to them. Their legitimacy rests on alignment with the pre-existing authority. Even reforms are framed as returns to proper order, correcting deviations that had crept in over time. The king does not decide what is just, he recognizes it. This layered authority implies a sequence in which governance existed before governance was human. The Anunnaki function as an earlier governing layer, one that defines the parameters within which human administration operates. Humans inherit responsibility for enforcement, not for definition. The structure is vertical, with decision preceding execution. The language used in these texts reinforces this sequence. Verbs associated with the gods often relate to fixing, establishing, or decreeing. Human verbs relate to carrying out, guarding, or restoring. The distinction is subtle but consistent. It suggests that the fundamental decisions shaping society were understood as having been set before humans assumed their roles. Even when divine displeasure is mentioned, it is framed as a response to human failure to maintain order, not as a change of mind. Punishment restores balance rather than introducing new conditions. The system is corrective, not experimental. This stability implies that the governing framework was considered complete. The Anunnaki's presence in legal texts also bridges temporal gaps. Their authority remains constant across dynastic changes and regional shifts. While kings rise and fall, the divine names persist. This continuity allows administration to resume after disruption without redefining its foundation. The authority to decide remains intact, even when human structures falter. If divine authority functioned as an inherited layer of governance, then human law emerges as its expression rather than its origin. The earliest administrators and judges did not see themselves as creators of order. They were caretakers of decisions already rendered. If so, then the question becomes less about belief and more about sequence. If decisions were understood to precede human judgment, what moment marked the transfer of responsibility from that earlier governing layer to human hands? And under what conditions was that authority first entrusted rather than imposed? If authority was understood as prior to human judgment, then law itself appears not as a proposal, but as a reception. When the earliest legal inscriptions emerge in Mesopotamia, they do not resemble working documents. They do not contain revisions, alternatives, or marginal corrections. They stand complete, articulated with confidence, as though the process of formulation had already occurred elsewhere. The earliest law codes known to us are preserved as formal inscriptions, not as drafts or instructional notes. Their language is deliberate and finished. Conditions are specified, penalties assigned, and exceptions accounted for. The structure anticipates misuse and ambiguity, suggesting experience rather than experimentation. These texts do not read like attempts to discover justice. They read like efforts to restate it correctly. What is absent from the archaeological record is any visible precursor stage. There are no partial codes, no trial clauses, no evolving versions preserved in clay. Law appears suddenly in durable form, carved or inscribed for permanence. This mode of preservation implies that by the time law was written, it was already considered settled enough to be fixed. The scribes responsible for these inscriptions treat law as something that must be copied accurately. The phrasing is consistent across regions and periods, even as political authority changes. This consistency suggests that the law was not bound to a single ruler's discretion. It belonged to an inherited framework that rulers were expected to uphold rather than reshape. In the inscriptions themselves, kings rarely claim authorship. They present themselves as transmitters, charged with making existing law visible and enforceable. Their legitimacy derives from fidelity. To rule justly is to preserve what has already been defined, not to introduce novelty. Even when reforms are mentioned, they are framed as restorations of proper practice. Legal language also reveals an assumption of shared understanding. Terms for injury, compensation, and obligation are used without explanation. The texts do not define basic concepts. They apply them. This implies that the audience, judges, officials, and citizens was already familiar with the principles being inscribed. Writing serves to formalize, not to teach. The completeness of these codes extends to their scope. They address a wide range of social interactions, from property and labor to family relations and personal harm. This breadth suggests accumulated experience. The law anticipates situations that would only arise through prolonged social complexity. Its readiness implies memory rather than improvisation. In some inscriptions, divine authority is explicitly invoked as the source of law. The gods are named as those who established justice and entrusted it to the king. This attribution aligns with earlier administrative texts, where divine decision precedes human action. Law, like measure and language, is treated as something given before it is enacted. The absence of drafts may reflect how law was held before it was written. It may have existed in oral judgments, ritual precedents, or institutional memory maintained by officials. Writing captures the law at the moment it is deemed stable enough to endure beyond immediate enforcement. The act of inscription marks confidence, not creation. When disruptions occur, floods, dynastic collapse, or shifts in power, the law does not reappear in altered form. Later rulers emphasize their adherence to earlier codes. Deviations are framed as corruption, not evil. This persistence reinforces the idea that law was anchored in a remembered order that outlasted individual regimes. If law codes emerge without visible drafts, then the drafting process may not belong to the written record at all. It may belong to a prior phase of governance where decisions were rendered, tested, and stabilized before being entrusted to writing. The tablets preserve the result, not the deliberation. If so, then the sudden appearance of complete law codes suggests that by the time humans inscribed justice in clay, they believed its form had already been decided. Where, then, was law shaped before it was written, and who determined that it was ready to be fixed beyond revision? If law appeared as something already settled, then knowledge concerned with the body follows a similar pattern. The earliest medical and diagnostic tablets do not read like tentative inquiries into illness. They do not record experiments, debates, or evolving hypotheses. They present conditions, symptoms, and responses with a steadiness that suggests recollection rather than discovery. Medicine, in these records, arrives without a visible beginning. The diagnostic texts are structured with careful regularity. A sequence of observed signs is followed by an identification and an outcome. The language is precise and restrained. There is little commentary, no speculation about causes beyond established categories. Illness is treated as a known condition that manifests in recognizable ways. The task of the practitioner is not to investigate, but to recognize correctly. Therapeutic tablets reinforce this impression. Remedies are listed with measured ingredients, ordered procedures, and expected effects. The formulations do not vary significantly across copies. When variations appear, they are minor adjustments, not alternative approaches. The emphasis is on correctness and transmission. A remedy works because it has worked before. What is striking is the integration of medical practice into administrative and ritual life. Healers are listed among temple personnel. Treatments are recorded alongside offerings and duties. Medicine is not a marginal craft, but an institutional responsibility. Its knowledge is curated, archived, and taught within established frameworks. This integration implies that healing was considered part of maintaining order rather than a field of innovation. The language used in these tablets often distinguishes between observation and attribution. Symptoms are described in concrete terms: temperature, pain, discharge, while causes are aligned with broader conditions of imbalance or disturbance. The texts do not argue for these associations. They apply them. This suggests that the conceptual framework underlying diagnosis was already accepted. Some tablets attribute illness to breaches of order, whether ritual, moral, or environmental. Others remain purely descriptive. The coexistence of these approaches does not appear contradictory to the scribes. Both are preserved without hierarchy. This suggests that medical knowledge was cumulative, accommodating multiple layers of understanding without discarding earlier ones. The role of the practitioner is consistently framed as interpretive rather than inventive. He reads signs, applies known remedies, and restores balance. There is no sense that each case advances the field. Success is measured by adherence to established procedure. Failure is attributed to severity, timing, or factors beyond control, not to inadequacy of the system. As with law, there is no archaeological evidence of a developmental phase preserved in writing. There are no crude remedies superseded by refined ones, no discarded theories visible in the record. The tablet's present medicine is already formed by the time it is inscribed. Writing serves to safeguard, not to explore. The continuity of medical texts across periods of disruption is notable. After occupational gaps or political collapse, similar diagnostic sequences reappear. Terminology remains stable. Remedies persist. This persistence implies that medical knowledge survived interruptions intact enough to be resumed. It was not rebuilt from scratch. Divine references appear in some medical texts, but they function differently than in hymns or myths. Deities are invoked as part of the framework within which illness occurs, not as experimental agents. The Anunnaki are not described as teaching medicine step by step. Their presence signals alignment with order. Healing restores what has been disturbed. From the scribe's perspective, medicine is not a progressive accumulation of insights. It is a body of correct knowledge entrusted to practitioners. Its authority lies in its age and consistency. The act of writing it down does not claim originality. It claims preservation. If healing knowledge appears without a recorded beginning, then its origins lie beyond the tablets that preserve it. It may have been refined through long practice before being committed to clay, or inherited from an earlier system that valued balance and recognition over experimentation. Writing captures the moment when this knowledge is considered stable enough to endure. If medicine, like law and measure, is treated as something recalled rather than devised, then the pattern deepens. What earlier conditions required such knowledge to be held, preserved, and eventually restored? And what interruption made its reappearance necessary rather than its invention? If healing knowledge returned intact because it was already held within an older framework, then the sky above Mesopotamia was approached in the same manner. When the tablets turn upward, they do not record surprise. They do not describe discovery. The stars are not introduced as newly noticed phenomena. They are treated as a fixed order that has always been there, waiting to be read correctly. The earliest astronomical texts are not observational diaries. They are lists. Constellations are named, sequences established, and movements correlated with terrestrial outcomes. The structure of these tablets assumes familiarity. Stars rise, culminate, and set according to expected patterns. Deviations are noted not as opportunities for new theory, but as omen signals that something within the established order has shifted. Star lists demonstrate this most clearly. They organize the sky into segments, assigning groups of stars, 2 months, directions, and functions. The names themselves are stable across copies and centuries. This stability suggests that the sky was already categorized before it was written down. The act of inscription fixes a known arrangement rather than proposing one. Celestial omens extend this approach into administration. The movement of planets, eclipses, and unusual appearances are recorded with corresponding outcomes for kingship, harvest, or stability. These correlations are presented without justification. The texts do not explain why a particular event signifies a particular result. They apply the association as established knowledge. The sky communicates because it has always communicated. The language of these tablets reinforces the sense of inheritance. Signs are read, interpreted, and reported. The observer's role is to recognize, not to hypothesize. The sky is not interrogated. It is consulted. Accuracy depends on correct identification within a known system. In later compilations, such as extensive omen series, the accumulation of celestial knowledge appears vast, yet its tone remains archival. Hundreds of entries catalog possibilities and outcomes, preserving them without commentary. The sheer scale implies long-term accumulation, but the writing itself does not narrate that accumulation. It presents the result as something already assembled. This approach aligns with how time itself is treated. Calendrical systems, based on lunar and stellar cycles, appear early and persist with minimal alteration. Intercalations are managed within established rules. The alignment between celestial observation and civic scheduling is precise. Festivals, offerings, and administrative cycles depend on these calculations. The sky regulates human activity because its order is trusted. The Anunnaki appear indirectly within this framework. Certain stars and constellations are associated with divine authorities who oversee domains of order. These associations are not mythic embellishments within the astronomical texts. They function as references, anchoring celestial regularity to administrative stability. The gods do not discover the sky. They are aligned with it. What is absent from the record is any sense of progressive refinement. There are no early attempts later corrected by better observations. When adjustments occur, they are framed as restorations of correct reckoning, not as new insights. The sky's order is assumed to be constant. Human alignment with it may falter. After periods of disruption on the ground, astronomical texts resume without loss of structure. The same constellations are named, the same correlations applied. This continuity suggests that celestial knowledge survived interruptions, just as legal and medical knowledge did. It was not reconstructed through fresh observation alone. It was remembered. From the scribe's perspective, astronomy is not a science advancing through discovery. It is a discipline of preservation. To observe is to confirm what is already known. To record is to safeguard against forgetting. The sky is treated as an archive older than any tablet. If the stars were understood as part of an established order that humans could read but not redefine, then astronomical knowledge occupies a unique position. It bridges the visible and the inherited. It requires observation, yet it denies novelty. The sky becomes a constant reference point through which order can be recalibrated after disruption. If so, then the earliest astronomical tablets do not mark the beginning of human engagement with the heavens. They mark the moment when that engagement was fixed into writing. Before that moment, the sky was already speaking, already ordered, already meaningful. If the heavens were read as memory rather than discovery, then one final question remains. Who first aligned human time and fate with the stars? And under what earlier conditions was that alignment established before it ever needed to be written down? If the sky could be read again without relearning its order, then the same expectation governed life on the ground. After destruction, after silence, after layers of silt sealed earlier floors, the return of administration does not resemble an experiment. The tablets that appear in early post-flood layers do not test procedures or invent new forms of control. They resume. The earliest bureaucratic tablets recovered above flood deposits are modest in appearance. They are small, utilitarian, and focused narrowly on essentials: grain rations, labor assignments, livestock counts, tool inventories. Their scope is limited, yet their structure is complete. They employ the same accounting logic, the same numerical conventions, and the same institutional categories seen before disruption. Nothing in their format suggests uncertainty about how administration should function. These tablets are not transitional documents. They do not bridge an old system to a new one. They behave as though the system never ceased to exist, only its expression. The scribes who produce them do not annotate changes or justify procedures. They write as if resuming an interrupted task, confident that the framework they are applying remains valid. The vocabulary reinforces this impression. Terms for offices, dependents, rations, and obligations reappear without explanation. Titles associated with temple and storehouse administration are used as though their roles are understood. Even when personnel differ, the categories remain fixed. Administration treats people as replaceable within enduring structures. Archaeologically, these tablets often appear in rebuilt administrative spaces that mirror earlier layouts. Storehouses occupy familiar positions. Distribution points follow established routes. The physical organization of bureaucracy aligns with the written one. Space and text reinforce each other, both restoring known patterns. What is especially notable is the absence of improvisation. In conditions where resources must have been scarce and populations unsettled, one might expect flexibility. Instead, the record shows insistence on correct procedure. Rations are measured precisely. Labor is recorded methodically. This insistence suggests that administration was not merely practical, it was normative. To administer correctly was itself an act of restoration. Later, inscriptions sometimes acknowledged that chaos had prevailed before order was renewed. Yet these acknowledgments are brief and formulaic. They do not describe how administration was rebuilt. They simply state that it was. The mechanics of restoration are left unstated, implying that they were known and did not require documentation. The role of scribes in this process is central. Their training appears uninterrupted by the disasters that halted writing. Scribal conventions persist with remarkable consistency. Sign forms may vary slightly, but accounting logic does not. This continuity suggests that scribal knowledge was preserved outside the archive during periods when tablets were not being produced. Administrative authority is also framed as delegated rather than devised. Officials act within defined limits. Their decisions are constrained by established rules. Even penalties for failure to deliver or perform are standardized. Administration does not negotiate its own legitimacy. It assumes Italiano. Divine references, when they appear, do so at points of validation rather than operation. The Anunnaki are named as overseers of order, invoked to guarantee that restored administration aligns with proper decree. They do not instruct scribes on technique. Their presence marks legitimacy, not process. The process is already understood. Over time, administrative complexity increases again. Records become more detailed. Personnel are named. Institutions expand. Yet this growth follows familiar trajectories. It elaborates rather than redefines. The initial post-Druid tablets establish continuity. Later ones build upon it. The pattern suggests the bureaucracy was not reinvented because it was never conceptually lost. Its expression depended on stability, but its form depended on memory. When conditions allowed, that memory reasserted itself through writing. The tablet becomes the surface on which order reappears, not the place where it is conceived. If administration resumes without invention, then the pause in record-keeping marks a suspension of capacity rather than a collapse of knowledge. The system waits. When it returns, it does so whole enough to function immediately. If so, then the question that follows is quiet but unavoidable. If human administration could disappear and return intact, what larger framework preserved it during the silence? And who determined when order was ready to be written again? If administration could return without explanation, then beginnings themselves appear to be treated with restraint. In the Sumerian record, renewal is acknowledged, restoration is celebrated, but a second origin is never named. The texts move forward as though something fundamental is resumed, yet they avoid the language that would declare a new creation. What is implied structurally is left unspoken linguistically. Creation language does exist in the corpus, but it is carefully bounded. Accounts of first formation describe humanity's initial placement within an ordered world, their assignment to labor, and the establishment of cities and cult. These passages are framed as distant, foundational events. They occupy a singular position in time. Later, disruptions, floods, withdrawals of kingship, collapses of cities are never described with the same vocabulary. They reset conditions without restarting existence. After the flood, texts speak of return rather than rebirth. Kingship is said to have descended again, not to have been created anew. Cities are rebuilt, not refounded in principle. Humanity continues without comment on its status. The language implies continuity of kind, even if continuity of circumstance has been broken. The second beginning, if it exists, is treated as administratively unnecessary to name. This avoidance is consistent across genres. King lists separate reigns before and after catastrophe, but do not mark a new humanity. Legal texts resume jurisdiction without redefining the subjects of law. Medical, astronomical, and administrative tablets continue to address the same categories of people and responsibilities. The system behaves as though its subjects are unchanged, even when the conditions that sustain them have been interrupted. The silence is not accidental. Sumerian scribes were precise in marking transitions they deemed relevant. They named dynasties, counted years, recorded omens, and noted divine displeasure. That they did not name a second creation suggests that such an event did not fit within their framework of recordable change. Creation, once accomplished, does not repeat within the administrative imagination. Instead, the texts rely on structural markers. Long reigns give way to shorter ones. Cities shift. Authority is withdrawn and restored. Writing pauses and resumes. These shifts imply a reset of conditions without requiring a redefinition of humanity itself. The record tracks order, not existence. As long as humans remain legible to administration, their origin does not need In some compositions, humans are described as having been reduced in number or scattered, but not replaced. Survival is assumed. Even when catastrophe is total in effect, it is partial in language. The world is damaged, not remade. This distinction allows the scribes to preserve continuity of responsibility. Humans remain accountable to measures, laws, and decrees that predate the disruption. The Anunnaki occupy a crucial position in this silence. They are associated with creation in early accounts and with restoration in later ones, but never with repetition. Their decrees endure. Their authority is not reset. If humanity were recreated, one might expect a renewed declaration of purpose or role. Instead, purpose is resumed without announcement. Labor continues. Offerings are restored. The same obligations apply. This pattern suggests that the scribes understood creation as a singular act, whose effects could be suspended but not duplicated. To name a second creation would imply a change in the nature of order itself. The record resists that implication. It prefers to treat disruption as a temporary withdrawal of stability rather than as a failure of the original arrangement. Architecturally and administratively, this approach is consistent. Builders restore temples to earlier plans. Administrators reapply established systems. Healers and observers resume known practices. Nowhere is there a declaration that the world has begun again. There is only the sense that it has been allowed to continue. If humanity had been created twice, the second time would have been functionally identical to the first. From the perspective of administration, there would be nothing new to record. The same categories would apply. The same measures would hold. The same laws would govern. Naming the second beginning would add nothing to the maintenance of order. The silence, then, becomes meaningful. The absence of recreation language does not deny disruption. It absorbs. Italiano. The record implies that what matters is not how many times order is interrupted, but whether it can be restored without redefining its subjects. If the second beginning is never named because it leaves no administrative difference, then the question shifts again. What threshold would have required the scribes to acknowledge a new humanity? And what does their refusal to do so suggest about how complete the first erasure was allowed to be? If the silence around a second beginning was intentional rather than accidental, then its logic does not remain confined to Sumer alone. When the frame is widened beyond the southern Mesopotamian plain, similar patterns emerge in neighboring records. They do not repeat Sumerian language, nor do they align perfectly in detail. Yet they share a structural concern with interruption and resumption. Discontinuity, rather than origin, becomes the problem to be managed. In early Akkadian administrative texts, the emphasis on restoration mirrors Sumerian practice. When authority changes hands or cities fall and recover, the language does not announce novelty. Offices are reoccupied, measures reaffirmed, and cultic duties resumed. Even as Akkadian replaces Sumerian in many contexts, the underlying administrative logic persists. The shift in language does not signal a shift in order. It suggests continuity beneath surface change. Legal traditions outside Sumer exhibit similar restraint. Early law collections from neighboring regions present themselves as confirmations of justice rather than innovations. Rulers frame their decrees as acts of clarification, correction, or renewal. They speak of establishing equity again, implying an earlier standard that had lapsed. The concern is not how law came into being, but how it is brought back into alignment. Flood traditions across the Near East further reinforce this shared structure. Accounts preserved in later texts describe overwhelming inundations that disrupt human settlement and authority. Yet these narratives rarely dwell on the creation of a new humanity. Survival, continuity, and restoration dominate the aftermath. The flood functions as a divider, not a rest. Time is segmented, but existence continues. Archaeological evidence supports this perspective. In the Levant and Upper Mesopotamia, flood deposits and abandonment layers punctuate settlement sequences. Reoccupation often follows familiar patterns. Architecture resumes established orientations. Administrative artifacts reappear with recognizable forms. Even when cultural styles shift, the logic of organization remains legible. The break is acknowledged materially, but not narratively elaborated. In Egyptian records, where creation language is more overt, a similar distinction exists between cosmic origin and historical disruption. Creation is singular and distant, while later chaos is something to be overcome rather than renamed. Kings present themselves as restorers of Mohat, the proper order, not as creators of a new world. The emphasis lies in returning balance, not redefining humanity. What unites these traditions is not a shared story, but a shared administrative sensibility. Across regions, scribes and officials seem more concerned with preserving frameworks than with narrating beginnings. Writing is mobilized to stabilize after rupture, not to explain the rupture itself. The record resumes when order can be enforced again. This suggests that early bureaucratic cultures treated discontinuity as a recurring risk rather than an exceptional event. Floods, collapses, and withdrawals of authority were expected possibilities. Systems were designed to survive them conceptually, even if not materially. Knowledge could be held in memory, ritual, or institution, until conditions allowed its return to writing. The absence of explicit second creation language across these cultures may reflect a shared boundary of recordability. To name a new creation would imply that prior categories no longer applied. It would require redefining labor, law, measure, and obligation. Instead, the records consistently assume that these categories remain valid, even when temporarily uninformed. In this light, the Sumerian reluctance to name a second beginning appears less anomalous. It fits within a broader Near Eastern pattern in which history is segmented by disruption but governed by continuity. Creation belongs to the realm of ultimate origins. Administration belongs to the management of return. The Anunnaki, like other divine assemblies and neighboring traditions, occupy a stabilizing role within this pattern. They are associated with decrees, destinies, and boundaries that persist beyond catastrophe. Their authority does not reset with each disruption. It anchors the possibility of restoration. The human role is to realign with what has endured. What emerges from these parallel memories is not evidence of diffusion, but of shared concern. Early civilizations across the region appear preoccupied with how order survives interruption. They develop record-keeping systems that assume loss and recovery rather than linear progress. Writing becomes a tool for reattachment to a remembered structure. If discontinuity was an expected condition across early Near Eastern societies, then the Sumerian record may represent one expression of a wider administrative philosophy. Civilization is not portrayed as a single ascent, but as a cycle of legibility and silence, interruption and resumption. If so, then the question that follows is not whether Sumer was unique, but whether the idea of repeated erasure and restoration belonged to an even older shared memory. What earlier experiences made ancient cultures so attentive to survival without reading? And what had they already lived through that made continuity have to ruin their primary concern? If parallel traditions preserve interruption without origin, then the Sumerian record's final position becomes clearer, not through what it asserts, but through what it declines to clarify. Across tablets of different genres and periods, continuity and rupture are both present, carefully maintained in tension. The record does not resolve this tension. It preserves it. Administrative texts insist on continuity. Measures remain valid. Offices persist. Procedures resume. Legal inscriptions enforce obligations as though nothing essential has changed. Kings restore. Scribes copy. Builders rebuild. The language of practice assumes that the framework of order has endured. Yet other layers of the record acknowledge disruption just as firmly. Floods interrupt sequences. Kingship is withdrawn and returned. Writing itself falls silent. These are not minor disturbances. They fracture chronology and erase material traces. The record does not deny this. It simply refuses to reconcile the fracture with the continuity it also insists upon. This refusal is visible in how time is handled. King lists present long, orderly successions punctuated by abrupt transitions that receive no explanation. The years are counted with precision until counting stops, then resumes as though nothing fundamental requires commentary. The structure allows both statements to coexist. Something ended, and something continued. The mechanism linking the two is not supplied. The same pattern appears in institutional language. Temples are said to have ancient foundations, even when rebuilt after destruction. Offices are described as eternal, despite evidence of abandonment. The words again and as before recur, signaling restoration, yet they do not specify what intervened. The interval is acknowledged, but left undescribed. It is not ignorance, it is restraint. In scribal practice, this restraint becomes methodological. Texts are copied faithfully, even when their referents have shifted. Older formulas are preserved even when political realities change. Rather than updating the framework to reflect disruption, the scribes anchor their work to inherited forms. This choice suggests that preserving continuity was more important than explaining rupture. Some tablets come closest to acknowledging contradiction when they juxtapose incompatible conditions without comment. A text may invoke primordial authority while addressing immediate administrative concerns. A king may claim restoration of ancient order while listing unprecedented actions. The contradictions are allowed to stand. They are not smoothed into coherence. This tolerance for unresolved tension implies a different purpose for writing. The tablets are not meant to explain history in a causal sense. They are meant to stabilize function, as long as obligations can be enforced and memory preserved. The precise nature of past disruption does not require articulation. Writing secures alignment, not narrative closure. The Anunnaki occupy a similar ambiguous position. They are associated with origins and with restoration, with decrees that precede human action, and with authority that validates its return. Yet they are never used to bridge the contradiction explicitly. The texts do not say that divine action erased one humanity and instituted another. They do not deny it, either. They leave the relationship between divine authority and human discontinuity undefined. What the records refuse to explain may reflect what could not be explained without destabilizing the system they served. To describe a complete erasure of humanity, followed by a new creation, would raise questions about obligation, legitimacy, and continuity of law. If humans were fundamentally replaced, why would the same measures apply? Why would the same decrees bind them? Silence preserves applicability. This refusal also suggests confidence that explanation was unnecessary. The scribes wrote for an audience that already accepted the coexistence of rupture and continuity. The tension did not require resolution because it was lived. The record mirrors that experience rather than interpreting it. In Tissensei, the tablets act as surfaces of alignment rather than windows into origin. They align present practice with remembered structure, even when the path between them is obscured. The gaps are not oversights. They are boundaries of recordability. What remains then is not a hidden narrative waiting to be extracted, but a pattern of deliberate omission. Civilization, as preserved in clay, acknowledges that it has been interrupted and restored without ever stating how much was lost in between. It insists on memory while conceding erasure. It holds both positions without synthesis. If the Sumerian record consistently refuses to explain how continuity survives total disruption, then perhaps that refusal is itself the final evidence. Not evidence of a single event, but of a way of remembering that accepts loss without redefining order. If so, then the unanswered question is not what happened between the silences, but why the scribes believed that whatever happened did not need to be written. What experience taught them that civilization could resume without explanation? And what did they assume their successors already knew without being told?